Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 2025 Giller Book Club. I'm Jacob Alvarado, and I'll be your host for tonight. A couple quick reminders before we get things going. First off, please make sure you have your Zoom on a side-by-side view for the best possible viewing experience. Also note that our conversation will be followed by a Q&A period, so if you have any questions for Deepa, please submit them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. It's now my profound pleasure to introduce our interviewer for this evening, Sindhya Banu. Sindhya is the author of the story collection Seeking Fortune Elsewhere. She's the 2023 winner of the Oregon Book Award for Fiction, the New American Voices Award, and an O. Henry Prize. She lives in Corvallis, Oregon, and teaches creative writing at Oregon State University. Tonight, Sindhya will be interviewing Deepa Rajagopalan, whose excellent short story collection Peacocks of Instagram was shortlisted for the Giller Prize last year. And without further ado, I'll hand things over now to Deepa and Sindhya. Take it away, guys.
Thanks, Jacob. Hi, Deepa. It's so great to be here with you today.
Wonderful to be here.
I would like to just introduce you. Deepa, this is Deepa's debut short story collection. I'm so excited to be talking to her today. Deepa Rajagopalan is the author of the short story collection Peacocks of Instagram, shortlisted for the 2024 Giller Prize. She won the 2021 PEN Canada New Voices Award for the title story of the collection, and she has an MFA in creative writing from the University of Guelph. Did I pronounce that correctly? Guelph, from the University of Guelph. Well, Deepa, I'd love to hear a little bit about how this book came to be. I know you work as an engineer by day. Would you tell us how you started writing and then how you started writing these stories?
Yeah, sure. I started writing when I was quite young. I actually used to, as a child, I used to read a lot. I was a voracious reader. And when I was 8 years old, it just occurred to me that books had authors and they were made by people. And I thought I could write one. And I was very resourceful, enterprising child. And I decided to write a novel when I was 8, and I started writing. And it was heavily plagiarized, mostly from the Adventures of Huck Finn. It had a female protagonist, though. Yeah, I mean, spoiler alert, that didn't go anywhere, but I kept writing. Um, I wrote, I wrote for school magazines, and I wrote like letters to my teachers during summer break, and I wrote for like the children's section of like newspapers. But yeah, I think I didn't end up getting into the arts at the time. I did an undergrad in engineering, and I started working in tech. And I did enjoy my work, but I did feel after a few years this sort of void in my life because I was not writing. And I returned to writing more seriously. And I went back to school. I did a certificate program at the University of Toronto, and then I did the MFA in the University of Guelph. And I fell in love with the short story form. I was working on a novel before I started the MFA, but during the MFA, I fell in love with the short story form. Particularly one book, How to Pronounce Knife by Suvankam Tamavangsa, really influenced me, and I wanted to write short stories. And it also helped that during an MFA, it's just easier to workshop short stories than to workshop like bits of a novel. And I got to work with Suvankam, which was incredible. And the first story I wrote was the title story, Peacocks of Instagram. And then I think I immediately kind of realized that I wanted to write a collection, and I sort of got the sense of what I wanted it to look like. I wanted to write about kind of present stereotypical versions of immigrants, specifically South Asian immigrants, and then subvert the reader's expectations of them. So that's kind of how all the stories in the collection kind of came to be. And I wanted each story to be very different from each other, but that was the genesis of it. Yeah, and I think I write fiction because I have to. I feel like I'm more truthful in fiction. I think I write because I sort of want to look at everything again slowly.
Yeah, yeah, and a lot of your characters are connected to the tech industry in some way, and through these stories, you show us other sides of them, of their personal life and their private life, and their imagined life in some
Yeah,
cases.
yeah.
Um, I would love to hear a little bit from that title story, Peacocks of Instagram.
Sure, I'll read for a couple minutes. So this is from the beginning of the story, Peacocks of Instagram. Peacocks of Instagram. I make a good living. I have a business selling peacock accessories on the internet. Earrings, bracelets, pendants, sleep masks, that sort of thing. Unlike other birds, the peacock does not derive its colors purely from pigments, but from a combination of pigments and photonic crystals. This combination is what causes the feathers of the peacock to be iridescent, creating a shimmering look. The essence of a single peacock feather is this: the eye a deep royal blue, an inverted heart shape, and around it layers of glossy turquoise, brown, yellow, and shades of green. I capture this essence in every accessory I make, using beads, fabric, and sometimes real peacock feathers. I make them by hand, and people here will pay ridiculous sums of money for anything handmade. I also work at the coffee shop by the mall. I've worked here for 17 years. 3 owners have come and gone. The average turnover of the other employees is about 6 months, but I have been the rock of the establishment. The local paper even did an article about me. It was good publicity for the store. I've seen the minimum wage go from $8.92 to $14. More recently, I almost single-handedly brought up our online rating from 2.9, burnt bagels, stale donuts, 19-minute wait at the drive-thru, to 4.4, excellent customer service, the Indian cashier lady made my day, good location, friendly staff, good variety. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. My earliest memory of seeing a peacock was with my family at the Krishna temple back home in Kerala. The temple had a few resident peacocks and peahens. One of the birds that was sitting in the middle of the courtyard stood up, strutted toward us, and began splaying out its feathers. It was strange and magnificent, but at that age I must have been 3 or 4. I was afraid and hid behind my father. He picked me up and told me there was nothing to worry about, and he told me that the peacock can foretell the rains. When it danced, it meant the clouds would soon burst and water our crops. Years later, my husband would tell me that this peacock story was one of the more ignorant ones he had heard. My husband is a peafowl researcher. If you say peacock, he will lose it and say, I don't just study one gender. In fact, I specialize in sexual selection. I met Kannan in Kerala 20 years ago when he was studying peafowl in a sanctuary in Idiki. I was 17. After my family was cremated, I was offered a job as a live-in caregiver for a paralyzed man. I said yes immediately and left the house I had grown up in.
Thank you. I love the beginning of that story because it immediately shows us how observant and astute and smart this character is, and she's a businesswoman, and she's aware of what she's doing, that she's also stayed at this coffee shop job for 17 years. And she does it really well, and she's sort of aware of who she is and where she's at. Um, and yet and she makes these beautiful products which she sells on Instagram, and she has many followers. Um, Yet she feels unseen in a critical moment when she is offering uh, to help, someone with their cause. She's kind of disregarded and dismissed, and it's painful to watch that happen. And a lot of your characters over and over are not seen fully for who they are and what they're capable of. And I guess maybe you could talk about your interest in that, or your own observations of the world that led to these stories.
Right, yeah. I think I'm preoccupied with how power and lack of power sort of manifests in immigrant communities, and what people do with that knowledge, depending on who they are, right? Um, at this point in time, when I was writing this collection, I was more interested in people sort of wandering about the fringes of society, right? Um, I wasn't at the time interested to write about, say, immigrant doctors or lawyers or academics who know their place and who have a lot of agency. But I wanted to write about the people who have little agency and, in many cases have to resort to some form of subterfuge to kind of get ahead or simply to survive.
Mhm.
Um, and it's not to say that I don't like books with immigrant academics or lawyers or doctors, or more traditional depictions of, say, an arranged marriage, and things like that. But it was like, for example, Jhumpa Lahiri's books. I'm just
Mhm.
fascinated by her books, which does tackle a lot of such topics. But I guess this book was a representation of what I was obsessed with at that point in time.
Mhm.
um like in the title story, like I said, I wanted to present this character who, at first glance kind of looks like a stereotype, but then
Mhm.
as you get to know her, you kind of just the reader's expectations are subverted.
Mhm.
And also another story, The Many Homes of Kanmani.
Mhm.
There's a foster child who is disadvantaged in many ways, who really practically has no agency. Like, she's shuttled between different foster homes. She doesn't really have any agency, but she's a different kind of character. She's very spunky and feisty, and she takes power in like sneaky ways because
Mhm.
that's all the agency she's got. So I guess that was the theme I was thinking about when I was writing this collection.
Yeah, and there's another story, a cake, in which a, a, a housekeeper in a hotel, Rania, is overlooked for a
Mhm.
manager position that she's very qualified for and deserves, and a man gets it who's coming from the outside. Um, and um, he does something to her, and um, she then uses that against him to kind of get the position she wants. And I felt like maybe, has worked hard, she deserves this job, she's not getting recognized, and in fact she gets hurt.
Mhm.
um, and uh, and she then, I feel like, maybe figures out how to play this game. Like, what do I do to survive? And
Mhm.
I'm curious about that in the experiences of, the immigrants that you're writing about, how they are maybe
Mhm.
learning how to survive in this system, and maybe not always in the way that makes them feel proud.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that that was exactly what I was going for. I wanted to see different versions of how that manifests, right? So when I was writing the collection, for each story, I gave like an adjective for each story for the voice of the story. So that was kind of quite adjacent to the voice of the character, but not fully. And for this story, I really wanted to have this character to have this silent rage. And I was at a conference last week, and the interviewer who was interviewing me referred to this as some innocent kind of trickery, which I thought was quite interesting. She does take revenge in the story Cake. She does take revenge in a quiet way.
Mhm.
And, that's because that's all the agency she's got. She tried
Mhm.
to do it in all the right ways. She took all these courses, she proved herself, but the job went to the man who was
Mhm.
incompetent, like we've seen over and over again in real life too. So that was the agency she had, right, to kind of resort to this type of trickery, um, because a lot of times people don't have the luxury. People kind of who are at the fringes of society don't have the luxury to be always morally superior, right? So I think that's an observation I've made, and sometimes it's a matter of survival, and how to be creative to survive. So I wanted to see that manifested in different ways in the different stories.
Yeah, that's interesting. The word revenge, it is revenge that she takes. and inherent to there's cruelty in that. In revenge, there's always cruelty, and so she has to be a cruel person, and she makes that choice. But and it is her only way. It is her only way to kind of move forward and move ahead and move past where she is, which is a really tough place to be stuck in. Uh,
Right.
I wanted to ask you, so I noticed this the first time I read the book a little bit, but I read it again before this event, and I noticed just how many characters appear and reappear throughout these stories, and I'm just so curious. And yet it's not presented as a linked collection. But there are these small links between many stories, and I'm curious how that came to be. And did you add links later? Did it start with one story and then you
Right.
decided a minor character needed a full story of their own?
It was kind of both. Like when I was writing the stories, I did notice organically some of those links happening. Like I did notice writing a story about a character who's older now that I'd already written. Or I noticed like while I was writing one story, a side character started to have more place and started to kind of have her own story in the story. And then I removed that and made another story. And then after I was done with writing all the stories, I removed all those links because I was like, this is not a linked collection or a novel.
Mhm.
So I removed everything, and then when I was assembling everything together, I missed those links. I felt that there was this community who had kind
Mhm.
of come together when I was writing the book, and now they don't know each other. It felt really weird. So I went back and added those links, and they were
Mhm.
quite subtle at first, even like subtler than how it is now. And my editor suggested that I make it more prominent so that more readers can notice it. So you will find, and I do like the idea of encountering a character from their point of view and then from somebody else's point of view in another story because you get a different version of who they are versus who they think they are. And then also some places are linked. And then I went back and made, if something wasn't there, I made sure that there is a link between all of the stories, either by place or a character. Uh,
Mhm.
and I really enjoy when I see that in collections. I think I saw that in your short story collection too, Seeking Fortune Elsewhere. Like, wasn't it there? Like there was
There
some,
are a
right?
few, but
There are,
not nearly to this
yeah,
extent.
yeah,
There
yeah.
are a couple, yeah.
I noticed that, and then I was reading another short story collection, After Parties by Anthony V. Nasso, and
Yeah.
also there were a few of these kind of offhand remarks or links between stories, and I found that really interesting, and I wanted to make them more prominent.
Yeah, and it sort of speaks to the form of the short story too, which is really an essence. I mean, it's a moment in time often in a person's life,
Yeah,
and it doesn't leave too much space for the expansive world of the other
exactly.
characters, but each person is living their own life at that time as well. And so this sort of writing lets you spend time with one person and then another, or visit another person later in life, which you
Mm,
did as well.
yeah.
Um, so I noticed too that a lot of the stories are marked by some kind of um, medical tragedy or event. There's a mother who needs a kidney, and she has a young daughter. There's a mother whose son is with a babysitter, and then there's a kind of tragic accident that affects the child then for the rest of his life. There's COVID in the stories too. And death because of COVID. So, um, I felt, I mean, death and illness and loss is a part of life, all life, but I felt that many of the stories were marked by an event like that. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think I'm just obsessed with healthcare, especially the Canadian healthcare system. Um, And by obsessed, I mean I'm just fascinated that it works, but also have had some terrible experiences with it. Um, Also, my parents worked in healthcare all their lives, and
Okay.
exposed to that world from a very young age. I thought everybody's parents worked in healthcare when I was a child. Um, and I guess I was kind of exposed to life-changing situations because of health, and kind of the politics of care and what that means, what that takes away or gives to
Mhm.
patients. Um, in fact, I had more more stories about healthcare that I didn't put in the book,
Oh,
because I really didn't want it to be just about that. Um, I think I just think about it a lot, how we sort of go about our lives being so sure about our plans and getting frustrated at minor inconveniences when, all of it could just crumble at any moment due to an illness or a tragedy. And I was interested to think about how do we return from that, right? How do we sort of reframe our lives in the context of this new knowledge? So that's what I was thinking about when I wrote those stories. And I think it just came more naturally to me because I've been exposed to people who worked in healthcare for a long time.
yeah. Yeah, and I think too, I wonder if that childhood and upbringing with healthcare professionals also gave you some insight into human psychology, because I feel like you see people at their most vulnerable. And even in your stories, it's a moment of tension then, when there's a great tragedy that's happening to a person or a family, and the way they act in those moments you capture on the page, and it tells us so much about a person, I think, in those moments.
Mm.
Um, well, speaking of your childhood, you spent either part or all of your childhood in Saudi Arabia, which is so interesting to me because you had um, less access to entertainment and popular culture maybe compared to the rest of us. And I wonder how that informed your writing. Maybe it let you imagine more. Maybe you wish you had more access to
Mhm,
I don't know, movies and television. But I wonder actually what it was like, and how
mhm.
it shaped you.
Yeah, it was quite boring. Um, we did live in this small town um, in Saudi Arabia, and we didn't really know much about, we didn't really have access to a lot of entertainment. Specifically, like when we went to India, we used to go to India for summer vacations, and I would be so excited to
Mhm,
expose to popular culture, a lot of it which was censored in Saudi Arabia. But yeah, when I lived there in Saudi Arabia, I was quite, it was a very sheltered upbringing. And we had a lot of time to read. I started reading at a very young age. I think I started reading before I was 3. And we didn't have a lot of libraries. We had this one tiny school library. I didn't have a lot of access to books kind of appropriate for my age. So I just read everything.
mhm,
I remember reading a grammar and composition book for fun and just having the time of my life with it. And even like recipe books, if I would go to my friends' places, their parents would have books, um, totally not appropriate for like a 8-year-old or a 10-year-old. I remember reading The Godfather when I was like 8 or 9, and
mhm,
a lot of it kind of went over my head. But I think it helped. With my imagination, because a lot of books I had access to then were also books by like Western authors,
mhm,
mostly like British classics. And I had to look up a lot of things because I just didn't know, didn't have the context of a lot of those things. And I had to look it up, or I would just have to live with the not knowing of parts of those stories. But I think it helped with my imagination because it kind of helped me go down rabbit holes and helped me um, sort of connect with cultures and times of in history that's very different from mine. Um, And I think, yeah, with writing too, I I had a lot of time to write, and I had an amazing English teacher who helped me see the beauty of literature and encouraged me to write. But I think what I would have liked more is, having access to people who were in the arts, right? Like just seeing somebody who's a writer or who uh, worked in the arts, which I didn't at all until I grew a lot older. I didn't
Mhm.
know what that would look like because we were in a migrant community. There were mostly people who worked in healthcare um, in our community. So I wish I had that access. I wish I could have seen examples of what a writer would look like and what their life would look like. But yeah, I think that's just been my experience. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me as well, I read books but didn't associate the author with a real person with, with a real life
Yeah.
who's
Yeah. Yeah.
actually out there.
Yeah, I read
Which,
my first book by a non-Western author when I was 14, and that book was The God of Small Things by
oh,
Arthur Roy, and that was just, it blew my mind away because I connected with not just the place. It's also that story is set in a fictional town called Ayamanam in Kerala, which is
mhm,
where I'm from, and very similar to the town that my ancestral home, my mom's ancestral home, was in. And I just felt like, oh, this is how it feels like when you actually connect with a book, not just the places and people, but also kind of that such a specific experience or the specific angst of being a Malayali in the world. It was really amazing to read that book.
yeah, yeah. Um, I I thought it was notable that some of the stories in the book are aware of the pandemic and COVID. And, in one case, there is a tech worker in India who dies of COVID, but not all the stories are, I think. And so my suspicion was that maybe you were writing this before and during the pandemic or slightly after. And I'm curious about that, the experience of doing that and maybe the difficulty or ease with which you were able to incorporate the pandemic. It's not so long ago that it happened. So what was that like?
Yeah, I wrote the collection between 2020 and 2022, so mostly during the pandemic.
Mhm.
When I was writing it, there were more stories that were aware of the pandemic because at the time I didn't know how post-pandemic would look like, right? Like I didn't know what a return to normal life would look like. But when I was finally assembling the collection, I removed pandemic references from stories where we didn't need it, right? So this story, there's a story called A Thing with Many Legs. That is that is set during COVID and kind of it required to be set during COVID. It needed to be a pandemic story because it explores this strange kind of intimacy that occurs virtually during such an uncertain time. And that's why it had to be a pandemic story. But I removed, other references from stories because I didn't want it to be kind of a pandemic collection, uh,
Mhm.
except for that story, which it made sense because it wouldn't work outside of the context of something like a pandemic.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, even though I wrote it during that time, I did kind of make sure that before I started sending it out, it made sense uh, to people outside of the context of COVID.
Yeah. Um, I also wanted to ask about your so some stories are set in Canada and there are some set in the United States. And I was thinking about how from India, one might think that life in Canada and life in the US are very similar, maybe even identical in most ways. But But you mentioned healthcare. The healthcare systems are very different. You referenced the Canadian healthcare system a few times. But in your stories for your characters, what is the difference? I mean, how did you think about the lives of the immigrants you write about in the US versus in Canada? Or is there not? Maybe, I mean,
Hmm. Yeah, I think this is such a good question. No one's asked me this before. Um, I think it is different. I think it's slightly different. I wasn't consciously thinking about it, but I have a perspective of it, from my life. But I wasn't thinking about it much while writing. But now that I think about it, like if you look at the Canadian protagonists, right, mostly first generation immigrants,
mhm,
in the stories in the collection, like Peacocks of Instagram or bestsellers or Rahel.
mhm,
These people are, I feel, slightly more independent and sort of less concerned with belonging to a specific community, like a South Asian community, for example,
mhm,
or a Malayali community. Um, I feel like they sort of find community based on what they like to do. Um, But in the American stories, there's some stories where they're set in California mostly, and some are kind of not very clear, but mid America. Um, there are characters who are sort of preoccupied with finding community in these microcosms of Indian establishments, like the Hindu temple in
mhm,
the story singing for the gods, or like the context of a wedding, of an Indian wedding in Livin, or even just this group of Indian women in driving lessons. Um, I think just having lived both in Southern California and for a brief period, but
mhm.
having lived there and in Ontario in Canada, uh, it has been sort of my experience, but like I wouldn't generalize it. I think it's
Yeah.
been my experience.
Yeah, I wonder if it has to do to, oh, so the story you referenced about a singer and it takes place in these temples in California. There is some reference to caste and status connected to caste, and
Mhm.
I wonder if some of it is also connected to pressure to excel or to be seen in a certain standing, w on the ladder, which
Yeah.
I didn't observe in all of your characters in Canada, and I don't
Mm.
know I don't know why. I mean, maybe it's a different and maybe it's a Canadian culture and an American culture also coming into play a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great observation. That's been my observation. Like I worked both in the US and Canada, and that has been my observation. In in the US, it's more aggressive. Like the work culture is
Mhm.
more aggressive, whereas in
Mhm.
Canada, it isn't as much. There's more balance and there's more kind of importance given to the person holistically. But again, that has been my specific experience. But yeah, I think when I was writing Singing for the Gods, I was also reading a lot of articles about how caste is suddenly a matter of discussion in Silicon Valley.
Mhm.
And I was just fascinated by that I mean, fascinated in a very troubled way, that, that could be the case. Even in India, like I lived in India for 9 years. I didn't really encounter a lot of caste-based
Mhm.
discrimination or any kind of discussion, really. I was aware of it because everybody kind of talked about it, but it wasn't, you know, something that I saw affecting people in my life.
Mhm.
So I was pretty shocked by that, and I wanted to look at it from a sort of different perspective. So that story is set in California. It has reference to Silicon Valley, but it's not set in Silicon Valley. But I just
Mhm.
wanted to think about, why would this exist? And where would, the seeds for this come from, right? So that's why I kind of talked about it in a subtle way.
Yeah. Well, coming back to some specific stories, one of my favorite stories is called Rahel, and it's about Rahel, a woman in Canada, and her lover Freddie, who lives in South Africa, and Freddie thinks that Rahel depends on him, that he is the love of her life, and um, they have a relationship over many, many years, and he's married and very wealthy. And when she dies, he comes to Canada and he learns things about her and her life and how actually rich and full her life was. And he never knew any of this. And it sort of devastates him. And it's not about a secret life she was keeping from him, I don't think, but it's about what he never even cared to find out. And so it's an interesting story. It's also one of the stories which, features a male character as one of the central characters. And I'd love to hear you talk about it.
I love that you talked about that story. That story is my favorite story, or at least it's the most fun I had writing the collection. That story came out of a prompt I gave myself. I had read this Alice Munro story called Corey, which is about a married man who has an affair with this woman. And in the end, there's a betrayal, like he betrays her and she finds out about that. So the prompt, and it's told from the point of view of both of these characters, kind of seamlessly goes back and forth. You don't even notice it unless you're very carefully reading it. So the prompt I gave myself, and I was just trying it out. I didn't think it would go into the collection, but the prompt I gave myself was it had to be a story about a married man having an affair with a woman, and there needs to be a betrayal in the end, but there needs to be another betrayal, which kind of gives more agency to the woman,
Mhm.
and also kind of go between these two characters' point of views. So after I wrote it, I was worried that it's going to be very similar to Alice Munro's story, but it turned out to be quite different because of my background, right? Like the Alice Munro story, Corey doesn't leave Southern Ontario, I think, as many of her stories don't. Whereas my story is kind of all over the place because of my background. But I absolutely loved writing that because a lot of the story is from this man's point of view. And he thinks he's great. He's not, but like he thinks he's great. And it was so much fun writing about a character who's not an admirable character from their point of view and really trusting the reader that they're going to get it,
Mhm.
that they will know who he really is without telling him, without giving my opinion of him.
Mhm.
So that was something I really had a lot of fun doing. And then this going back and forth between the two point of views, that was also fun to be able to do that seamlessly. My editor at some point said, why don't you give headings for each of the section, like whose point of view
Mhm.
it is? And I'm like, no, I don't want to do that because I want it to be seamless. So I did
Yeah.
make some changes so that it is not confusing, especially with the betrayal that's kind of happened before, but you come to know of it later. I just worked a lot on it so that it's not confusing.
Mhm.
But I really wanted to give more agency to the woman in the end. And that's why there's sort of that second betrayal, but like you said, it's not about the betrayal, but it's about like how full of himself Freddie was that he didn't care to ask. Right?
Mhm.
Like he really believed that she had a small life and he was the center of her life, of her life. But she just had a really full life, and he
Yeah.
didn't ask, so she just went about living her life. Yeah, and she also shows up in other stories, which I really enjoyed seeing.
Yeah, I really I thought it was so interesting because I read the story and then I started wondering, when at what point did she catch on? I mean, you think maybe that she's just not getting it, like she's stuck with this guy, but at some point it's not clear at what point she kind of went her own way, where that betrayal happened. Was it pretty early on? Was it far in? And it's really, and as with that Alice Munro story, Corey, the woman knows a lot. Like she's not being deceived the whole time. She's a willing participant in this. And so it's just interesting to go back and track in that story and also your story. It's not exactly clear, and you could interpret it in different ways, which is the beauty of it. I am being asked to remind the audience that we have about 20 minutes left, and to please submit questions. So I just have maybe one or two more questions for Deepa, and then we'll take audience questions, which you can put in the chat, I think. There's a Q&A. So there's a story called Bow Wow, and many of your characters are coming from a place where they're trying to move up in life and make more money and become more stable. But Prithvi and Bow Wow, like Freddie and Rahel, comes from a privileged background, and Prithvi is actually someone who gives up. His family owns a hotel, which he would have inherited, but he pursues the artistic life. He's someone who is giving up, the comfortable life in favor of pursuing his dream. And then he even takes another step to pursue, another dream. But I guess that idea of pursuing your dream comes up in a couple of stories, and not everyone is able to do that, but Prithvi is, and he chooses to, and there's a cost. Um, but maybe you could talk about that, and is it more possible for him because he's a male character, because he comes from that wealthy background?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question. Nobody's asked me about this this story. And in fact, this is the only story where like the central protagonist is a man. In Rahel, there's Freddie, but he's one of the two main characters, and he's sort of the antagonist. So I think I really wanted to write somebody who gives up a comfortable life to pursue the arts, right? Um, and I wanted that to be a man and somebody who comes from privilege because um, it's easier, I feel, like for men to do that. And if you have privilege to do that, right? Like to be able to pursue your dreams in that way. Like there's a story called Surya Listen, which is the story that we talked about earlier about this child who something like a tragedy happens, in this daycare or this home daycare situation. And his mom also had a dream of becoming a writer, Surya's mom, Bhanu. And she tries to pursue it, but she's not able to. Like she doesn't have a lot of privilege. And then this tragedy happens, and she kind of dedicates herself to taking care of her son. But Prithvi, on the other hand, he does give up all of that, but at the same time, like he has a support, like he has a backup, should something happen, right? Like he's able to do that because he can always go back to his family's money, right? If it doesn't happen. But also he is really passionate about about the arts, and he starts this drama institute, and he's a playwright, and he is really passionate about that. And I also kind of liked writing him because he's not vain, despite having this dream and going after it. He's not vain, and he's not that typical version of a man you would see in that situation. Like he has long graying hair, and he's straight, and he, you know, doesn't have that sort of ego that you would associate with men with power.
Mhm.
He doesn't get a lot of respect from, I mean, he gets recognition for his work from other people, but he doesn't really
Mhm.
get a lot of respect from his friends or family. But he sort
Mhm.
of knows his worth, right? Which is again, I feel easier for a man. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, I think he was an interesting character to write, and I guess the only kind of male character in the collection.
Yeah, yeah, and tragically, I mean, his wife, speaking of illness, his wife does support him, and she is one person who believes in him, but she's silenced because of a condition that she has, and
Yeah.
he's her sole caretaker, which also makes him sort of unusual as a man. He
Mhm.
does, he does all the work. I mean, he works and he does the work of the house and taking care of her. So it sort of makes him even more unusual, I think, as a character. Before we move on to audience questions, would you tell us about your next project if you're able to?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm working on a novel. It is sort of a nostalgic novel that follows the lives of three characters, a home daycare teacher, a young child who goes to her daycare, and this other person who sort of works for her and is also a tailor. And their lives are intertwined because of a tragedy that happens in Saudi Arabia during the first Gulf War. Only one of the characters knows what exactly happened, and the novel sort of follows this young girl as she grows up and tries to find out what happened. It takes place over a span of like 3 decades, moves from Saudi Arabia to India to the US. And yeah, I mean, two of these characters' point of views are kind of, or perspectives are told from the point of view, from the first person point of view. And the third character, which kind of starts more later in the book, is told from like a third person omniscient point of view. And it is sort of a memory. It's told from a place of memory for the most part. I'm really fascinated by books that do that, right? Like where it's kind of told from. So there's a different lens to what happened, and you're sort of figuring out your present by looking at your past. So that's what I was interested in. But yeah, I'm still writing it. So this is what it is right now. So we'll
Yeah. Yeah, we look forward to it. We have some questions for the audience. I just need to make sure my computer is charging, not so I don't lose you. Um, but our first question is, you mentioned that your editor suggested to think of a point of view for each story. I wanted to know if your book was accepted as a proposal. If yes, did that put pressure on you to create?
Mhm. Thank you for that question. I guess what I said for that specific story, Rahel, was that that story kind of seamlessly goes between the point of views of two characters, and she suggested mentioning just for that story whose point of view each section was from. And that's what I didn't want to do that for that specific story. So we kind of went back and forth on how to make it clear enough so that it's not confusing, but and yet not have to put that subtitle of whose point of view that story is told from. But otherwise, yeah, she didn't ask, my editor didn't ask me to uh, change or think about a specific point of view for any story. Like I just we went with the point of view that I had written them in. I did make a lot of changes as I was writing the book, like go back and forth on whose point of view a story should be told from. Specifically, that story, whatever happened, happened for the good. I had it's about like this mother who needs a kidney transplant, and uh, she kind of travels with her family halfway across the globe to try and get a donor. I had originally written that story from the point of view of the mother, and I found it very kind of claustrophobic because we
Mhm.
were in the, throughout the entire story, we were in that, space of being sick and being ill. And I found it was getting too melodramatic. So I rewrote that entire story from the point of view of the child. And like by focusing on things that children notice, I was able to create a bit of distance and be able to kind of observe from outside, which I thought worked well for that story. But yeah, like it wasn't accepted as a proposal. In fact, I don't know if you do proposals for fiction. It's typically for nonfiction, I think. You do book proposals. Um, yeah, so I wrote the entire collection and then I sent it to my editor. Like my editor acquired it after reading the whole thing. So there was no pressure in that sense, except the pressure I put on myself.
And did you have all those stories in the collection? It sounded like maybe you took out some, you
Well,
said
I
that
took
some
out
weren't there.
before I sent it out.
Okay, I
Yeah,
see.
I had like I would say there were two other stories that I didn't put in this because it was kind of similar to other stories in the collection.
Mhm.
But like they got placed elsewhere, or so it's
Okay,
just not here. And I'm glad, I didn't put those
yeah.
into this collection. Yeah.
We have another question. I'm also curious to know, how do you make time to write while also working a full-time job?
Yeah, it's not easy. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. It is a lot of work. I do wake up before dawn. I love waking up early. I wake up around 4 or 4:30 most weekdays. Then I write for a few hours. That's when my kind of brain is most um, I wouldn't say active, but it's just most creative, right? And I find that about 2 hours or even 1 hour writing at that time is worth, right? 3 hours of writing in the afternoon, at least for me, that's how it works.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, and I write more during the weekends. I don't really have a lot of time for anything else. Um, and yeah, I do give myself deadlines. If I'm working on a project, like for the novel, I give myself deadlines for each chapter. And sometimes I am lagging behind and try to kind of catch up in other ways.
Mhm.
But yeah, it is challenging, but I absolutely love this. Like I would be in a really bad mood if I didn't write.
Yeah.
So I just time for it.
That 4:30 routine, do you just get up and go to your desk and start?
Well, I write on the couch. It's probably not good for my back, but that's I make a cup of coffee. I do not look at my phone. Like that's the key.
Wow.
Don't touch the phone except to turn off the alarm. Sometimes I do break that and the whole day is ruined when I go into my phone first, but I just wake up and make a cup of coffee and get to writing. And it's dark. I love waking up when it's dark. Sometimes weekends I wake up after sunrise and I just hate it. I feel like I've lost
Mm,
something. Um, but I do go to bed early. Like I'm usually in bed by like 10.
yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. I also think that phones are a huge distraction. Anyone who wants to write a book needs to put their phone in the freezer while they're working. Someone else says, oh, that's not a question, but I've been reading South Asian writers for many years. Mukherjee, Umbriger, Divakarani, etc. I'm currently reading both Peacocks and Seeking Fortune. It's very refreshing to read from younger women writers. Keep up the good work and keep writing. That's so nice. You mentioned you just went to San Miguel and you met some writers. But do you have any favorite South Asian writers, or books? You
Mhm.
mentioned Arundhati Roy.
Yeah, Arundhati Roy is like all-time favorite. Jhumpa Lahiri, I mean, she's American, I guess.
Mhm.
Might even be Italian now, I don't know. But I love her writing. Recently I read a book called The Illicit Happiness of Other People by an Indian author who I think originally is from Kerala. His name is Manu Joseph. I love that. Um, yeah, I mean, I love not just South Asian, but a lot of non-Western authors' sensibilities that I enjoy. I'm amazed by translated works,
Mhm.
how they work in English, right? So I'm so curious to see like who did the magic, right? Like was it the writer or the translator? Like how did the magic retain, or how did it change? Like Murakami, um, Norwegian Wood is one of my favorite books of all time, which is interesting because that's like probably the only realistic fiction book that he wrote. That
Mhm.
have like a cat that starts talking, or like people who acknowledge that it's weird that a cat is talking. Um, and yeah, other books like Kazuo Ishiguro, even
Mhm.
though it does sound like very Western book, even though he's of Japanese origin. Never Let Me Go, Remains of the Day, like some of my favorite books. Orhan Pamuk, I love
Mhm.
books, especially Snow. Um, yeah, I think those are some of my favorite books I can think of right now.
Yeah. Well, we have just a couple minutes left. The folks at the Giller Prize asked us both to share what we're currently reading. What are you reading right now?
Yeah, I just finished reading Orbital by Samantha Harvey that won the Booker Prize
Mhm.
last year. I loved it. It's a really thin book and a quick read, but it was incredible. It was very poetic and kind of has 16 chapters that mimics the 16 times the space shuttle goes around or orbits the Earth. It's basically about six people who are on the space shuttle, and it has very little to do with space. It really is
Mhm.
looking into Earth and looking at Earth and its problems and politics and climate change, and it's a very interesting book. And then I just started reading The Life Cycle of a Common Octopus by Emma Knight.
Mhm.
I just read a couple chapters. I loved it. The language is beautiful. I'm looking forward to the rest of it. What about
Yeah.
you?
Well, I was thinking about books that I've read recently or that I'm reading that might be in conversation with your book. And I read recently this book called On Gold Hill by Jacqueline Moyer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a memoir, but Jacqueline Moyer started a small farm in California where she um, started growing rice, and she is half Indian, and her maternal side of the family's from Punjab, and she finds out this heirloom rice is actually from India, and it's a beautiful memoir. I'm also reading this older book. It's also nonfiction, but it's called Third Class Ticket
Mm.
by Heather Wood, and it's just fascinating. I mean, it's a true story about a woman in a small Bengali village who left her inheritance for the village, for the villagers to travel all around India by third class train, and it's just and a research a writer follows them as they do it, but. I also just finished, and I think it's really good this year, the best short stories. And because this is um, uh, an event about a short story collection, I think this year's anthology has some beautiful stories. There's a story by Brad Felver that does point of view really well and flashback. And it's very hard to write a good story, a good short story. It is not any less difficult than writing a novel, even though it's shorter. And so you've written a beautiful collection, and it's been great to talk to you. Thank
Same.
you
It's
so
been
much.
wonderful to talk to you. And I just want to let you know, and I don't think I've told you this, the first time I encountered your work was in Granta, the magazine, where I read, I think it was in Granta, right? Malliga Homes.
Uh-huh.
And I just was so fascinated by it. And then I waited for your book to come out, and then I read the whole book. And I'm so glad we're talking now.
Oh, thank you. Oh, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. It's a beautiful book.
Thank you.
Well, let's hand it back to Jacob.
Great. Thank you guys so much for those great book recommendations, of course, but also for that wonderful conversation. I really got a lot I really got a lot out of that, and I hope the rest of the audience did as well. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight. We have over 90 people in the audience, so that's really awesome. A few quick reminders before we get going tonight. If you know somebody who couldn't make it this evening, please make sure to let them know that this will be uploaded to our YouTube channel within the next couple of days. Please also join us for our next Giller Book Club a couple weeks from now, where Rachel Rose will be interviewing Carolyn Adderson about Carolyn's long-listed story collection, A Way to Be Happy. That's happening on March 5th. And if you've already joined our mailing list, you'll get a registration link or to that book club right into your inbox. But if you haven't already, then please go visit gillerprize.ca to sign up for that book club and for all the rest of the book clubs that are coming at you later this year. Thank you all so much for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.